What's good, guys? It is Sam here, and today I wanted to talk about Bernie Sanders' campaign and his heart attack. So, with that being said, I think there's three different groups of people that we have to kind of consider, and that's first the group that's going to vote for him no matter what happens, that are just 100% loyal to Bernie Sanders. Then there's the group of people who will just never vote for Bernie Sanders. They just think he's too liberal or he's a communist or this, that, and the other thing. They just don't care for him for whatever reason they might have. And then I think the most important group that we want to talk about is the group who's undecided. The group that could go either way. And there's a spectrum of people who are barely there versus people who are like, yeah, I think I do support him, but I don't know. There's a spectrum of that, but I think it's a large enough group, and it's going to be the most influential group of how this could potentially be impacted going forward. So I wanted to touch on that. Before we do any of that, if this is your first time here, what's good? My name is Sam, and with that being said, let's get into the video. So the other day, Wednesday, I think it was, Bernie's camp came out with that Bernie had just gotten, he was at a campaign event and had heart pain or chest pain, went to the hospital. He had 2 stents put in, which are essentially things that keep the artery open, as far as I understand, so that you don't get clogged blood flow or clots or whatever. For that certain oxygen and blood and nutrients to certain parts of the heart. So if an artery collapses and doesn't allow the blood to flow through, then you can't provide nutrients to that, so that tissue dies off. So it opens it up so that blood and oxygen and nutrients can still come through, and that tissue doesn't die off. And he was released, I think it was Friday, from the hospital. I think he had 2 stents put in. However, the very interesting thing about it is that I'm curious to know how this is going to impact his campaign. He's actually older than Joe Biden, but I don't think I've ever heard of, other than maybe supporters for Andrew Yang, or myself too. I mean, I do think that he's an older gentleman, which is awesome, cool. Like, I think that he doesn't portray that, where Joe Biden, I think, does. So I'm curious to know how it's going to impact those 3 groups. And then the last little bit, we're going to touch on the Google search volume and the YouTube search volume to give some perspective of what's happened just over the last week. Okay, so the first group, right? So the first group, I think, is probably going to be even more angelic about Bernie Sanders, in the sense that they're going to support him even more. There's probably a small percentage of that group that is going to not support him. They were on the edge, so they might switch into the undecided group. But I do think a lot of the supporters for Bernie are going to be even more evangelical about, I don't know if I'm saying that word right, but they're going to be even more of a supporter after something like this, from the standpoint of him being a human, and they have sympathy for what he's been through, and if he uses it as a tool to help his campaign as much as he possibly can, try to shape perception. He's got a very large online following, so if he is able to PR this in a way, he might actually be able to pull through on this one. If you take a look at the group that just does not support him, I think it actually might give them more fire, because they're going to think, well, they may already think that he's too old or he's part of the establishment. So when something like this comes out, this is just fuel for the fire, right? They're like, well, see, told you he's too fucking old, kind of thing. So I think that group, we don't even really have to talk about, because I don't think that's going to change much. I don't think it's going to change any. If anything, I think that group is going to grow, and there might pull a little bit from the first group. The first group being the group that supports Bernie Sanders pretty much no matter what, or who had already supported Bernie Sanders. Then a portion of that I do feel is going to leave to the undecided and to people who do not support Bernie. I think it's small single digits, but I do think It could be the tipping point of a larger trend, but we'll have to see how this plays out over the next several weeks. He is taking several days off from the campaign, which is the second time in the last month. About a month ago, he lost his voice. I think it was right after the debate, and then he was campaigning and he lost his voice. So when that happened, he also took a couple of days off and stopped campaigning. And I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but if you stop, and I'm not judging the person for doing what he's done, like at all by any stretch of imagination, but like just from a common sense standpoint, if you stop putting in work, even for short periods of time, if you had any momentum, that could easily take the air out of your sail pretty quickly. And I see this in the data that I'm looking at. I'm doing these analytical videos based on Google search volume and YouTube search volume and their ranking of their websites and their social media growth. And I can see some of this with Bernie Sanders. So if you want to check out those videos, go back to the channel. But anyways, I've actually been seeing this in the data for a little bit, that he's been losing a little bit of steam. So what I think is going to be super interesting is how this plays out before the next Democratic debate. Now, let's lastly talk about before we get into the Google and the YouTube search volume over the last 7 days for Bernie Sanders compared to the other top people, is the undecided group. And this, obviously there's the highest probability of being inaccurate in this group, I feel like, for what may or may not happen. I do think it is a interesting conversation to have, but if anything, I do think it's going to be slightly more negative from the standpoint that just his age, and I think that he doesn't portray that even slightly, which is awesome. The amount of like vigor and energy that I can see in the very brief bits of context that I take away from these different candidates, because I don't really pay attention to a lot of what they say. I just look at the data, and it doesn't appear at all from the little bits of pieces that I gather here and there throughout my research that there's anything other than just a shitload of energy inside of Bernie, even at 78 years old, and so much vigor and just desire to do this and try to do something. And so I think on the one hand, there's there's portion of that group who's going to be like, wow, he did this and he's going back on the trail. I think that's amazing, because he's even stronger than I thought he was. Instead of dropping out, he's going to continue going. So I think that he can pull a little bit in there. But for a larger portion of that undecided group, I believe that a larger portion of that is actually going to see that through a negative lens of the world, or a negative lens of their perception of how that happened and interpretation of what that means. And I think that a larger portion of the undecided will more than likely view it as more negative and move further away from supporting him. And I don't know if that's like 1/3 and 2/3 moving of the undecided moving further away from deciding for him, or if it's more 50-50, or it's 10-1, right? Like 9 people decide to move away for every person that stays. I don't know, but we will see, and we will keep you updated throughout this. So now let's take a look at our YouTube search volume, actually our Google search volume. So what I did here is I have Google Trends, and this collects all of the search volume in the United States on Google. And we just have the top 5 candidates here, Bernie, Joe, Elizabeth, Andrew, and Kamala Harris. And you can see, hopefully my face is not, there we go. You can see here that you have giant spikes right here for Bernie Sanders, and this is probably Wednesday, the 2nd. So let me see if I can pull this up down here. Well, my taskbar is not there, but I believe that was the 2nd. Today's the 6th, I think. Today's the 5th. So a few days ago, and you see that he jumped way up and it stayed ahead, and then it started to touch with at the top end with Elizabeth Warren, and it dropped down. And then on Friday, which was yesterday when he got released, there was another large spike relative to everybody else, and it's still higher. This will probably continue at least for the next day or several days, but we'll see how it plays out and how they're able to potentially PR that. Although he's not going to be on the campaign trail, so there will be less social posts in the sense of him being there and somebody taking a selfie and posting it onto their social media for their friends and whatnot to follow from the campaign trail. So there's going to be a lot less of that. So I do think that even though it's only a couple days off of the campaign trail, I do think that we could potentially see a pretty substantial impact, because if you're not going out there and hustling every day, and I'm not trying to say he should by any stretch of the imagination, I'm just talking about the overall race here for the Democratic nominee. And if you take several days off of really going hardcore and all the other people are going hardcore, I think that may be hard to come back from. He did just raise, I think, $25 million in the third quarter, which is towards the top of the field. So I think that's going to be helpful. It might have to spend that money in a more intelligent or thoughtful way, or creative and resourceful way, to try to garner the most amount of attention from the ad spending, the highest ROI from the ad spend, or just the dollars spent in general. But what we do see over the past 7 days is that Bernie was the #1 searched for across all of the U.S. Over the past 7 days, like right around 45 to 50% across every single state, pretty much. So that was kind of interesting. When I took a look at YouTube search volume, it actually told a different story. So on YouTube search volume, Andrew Yang is actually #1. And he has over 50%. If you look down here over at the geographic breakdown of the states, this is the combination of search volume for all of the candidates, right? So these 5 candidates, the search volume for all of them, the amount of search volume for Bernie Sanders out of the total was 24%. But Andrew Yang at 33%. So that's where this breakdown is. And you can see that Andrew Yang has over about 50%, 60-ish, low 60s in terms of the number of states that are searching for Andrew Yang over anybody else. So that is kind of interesting from YouTube standpoint. And he's even tied with Bernie Sanders over the last 7 days. We do see kind of like a little spike here on the second, and a little spike over here, but not nearly the same as we saw with the web search. So that is kind of interesting to see how that plays out. I'd love to know what your thoughts are down below in the comments of like what you think this is going to happen. Let's also try a customized date in the bottom here, and we'll actually try it from right before. Let's see. So we'll try it from the 1st of October through the 5th of October and see what that looks like on YouTube. This is right beforehand. So this probably tells a much more accurate representation of what has happened over the last 3 days here. And if we come down, we still see that Andrew Yang is getting a lot more search volume than everybody else. However, it's diminished. His lead is diminished greatly, and there's more for Bernie and whoever's red, Joe Biden. But over the last 4 days, the amount of support for Bernie, or the searches for Bernie, has drastically increased. And over the last day or so, the amount. Why is this only up to the 2nd? Okay, so this is basically 1 day's worth of data. So the data from YouTube is actually lagged, right? Let's see here. No, it pulls up. I don't know why it doesn't pull up when I do a custom thing here, right? So we're gonna go here, and we're gonna put in 10.1 to see what comes up. And I don't know why it's not pulling up all the data, because that only looked like 2 days here. Might do the same thing. Yeah. Okay. So it won't pull it up when I do a customized view, but that's probably fairly representative of the last couple of days. However, I'm not sure, because it's only 1 day worth of data, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, it came down, and then it shot back up a little bit on the 4th. So I'm curious to know what you guys thought. if you would like to leave your comment down below. I do like to answer comments at the end of the video, and that is about what we were to do. Or if you want to jump over to Instagram, there's a link in the description to jump over to Instagram. If you do want to answer questions at the end of the videos, use the hashtag STOLT so that I can see the video and I can answer it at the end of these. So let's start here. This is from Bilsara. I think her name is Sarah. With Trump, you have to factor in corruption and self-dealing, which I guarantee will eat up much of whatever amount he ends up having. And this is in reference to a video where we looked at how much Andrew Yang raised versus how much Trump raised. And if you want to check out the video, go back to the channel. I think there is a tremendous lack of empathy when it comes to the president, and I don't think that whether people think it's justified, clearly they do. I don't think that most of the people who are out there talking about Trump have a lot of empathy to understand why decisions are made, whether you agree with why the decision is made or not, or take a full scope of the actual story which is happening. And so I don't know. I think my personal belief is that if you think corruption is going on with Trump, that's how the world works in most of the times, when you just try to have the most integrity and be the most honest person you can, and that happens in business, where you just know who is trustworthy and who is not trustworthy in terms of how they interact from a business standpoint, or how the things that they say, but I do. That's at least my initial thought that comes up when something like that, when I see a comment like that. Now, if we come down here, this is I'm hoping Biden Warren knock out. This is from Vince. What's good, Vince? I'm hoping Biden Warren knock out, but it's not likely since Bernie with his health questionable. However, Yang will be number 2 by November. Okay, so this is this is a very interesting point here from Vince, is that he actually he thinks that Yang could be number 2, and I mean, I could see that. I could see that happening. Let's go back over here for a second. On YouTube, he's got the most amount of search volume on YouTube over the last 7 days. And the search volume on YouTube, I think, is YouTube's the number 2 site in the planet. So there's a tremendous amount of attention there. On Google, which is the number 1 site, so there's even more attention on Google. Andrew Yang, I think, is tied for he's number 4th. But I could see him potentially moving up. I'm not sure if Biden will stay. I'm not sure if Bernie will stay in. I do not think Biden's going to get the nomination. It just doesn't feel that way. Could be completely wrong, but it doesn't seem that way. And I think that, as I was mentioning earlier, some of the undecided for Bernie, I think there's going to be a larger portion of the undecided people who actually decide to view that event, his health from 1 month ago and from this past week where he's had a heart attack, as questioning his ability to handle the stress or pressures that may come with the role of president. And I actually was talking to somebody the other day who had a very interesting point about Bernie Sanders. This had nothing to do with his heart attack. And what she said was that she was watching a video, and the reporter had asked about his personal debt, and he said that he did have personal debt, and it was due to his wife's shopping or something along those lines. And she brought to my attention that because of something like that, somebody who can't even be honest about their own debt, she's like, I wouldn't want Bernie running the country, because that's her preference and her thoughts about debt. If somebody can't even be honest with themselves about having a conversation and leveling up with their spouse about what their priorities are and about money, then why would you want somebody like that to run the country? It was her point of view, and I think that is a very subtle and a very nuanced, unique way of looking at it that I would not have noticed because I don't pay attention to the context of what these players say, what these candidates say, right? I'm just looking at the data 97% of the time. So I thought that was very interesting and insightful. Don't forget to press that subscribe button and that bell notification to see future videos like this. Peace.